Y'all surprised me. That's fine. Yeah. How many more do we need?
I'm just gonna leave one more.
All right. All right. All right. V, how you doing, sir?
Pretty good.
All right. I know y'all needed copies.
I'll take one if you got an extra.
You got one. He's making. You need one, and you need one. So we need two more, Basel.
Okay.
Well, just one more because you have one. All right.
Yeah, we can share it. I'm just interested in know, did they add a slot for the compensation on the North Carolina contract?
No.
Okay.
No. There's not. There's not a spot
More
for
on
it.
South Carolina. I
Yeah.
think.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, there's not a spot on here for spelled out compensation. So there's. I'm gonna go over the options that they have given us that we can put it in there and how to do it. But still, we got to make sure that it would be compliant with the lender. As far as that, I need to make sure. Basel, we're on.
I think in South Carolina, they have like papers closing costs.
Hey, Basel, we're on. All right. All right. Very good.
They have a better looking contract in my opinion.
All right.
North Carolina.
I just don't do enough of them to be comfortable with them.
Yeah.
Well, I want to welcome everybody this evening. He's making a couple more copies for those that don't have them yet. And then those that are watching from their home, we're going to be going over the 2T offer to purchase contract this evening. It changed. We got a new form this month. So we're going to be going over that, plus the changes that they have come out with as far as compensation, realtor commission goes in relation to the offer to purchase. So for everyone that has a copy of it, you can go along with it. We're going to go paragraph by paragraph. And those that are at home, if you can pull up a copy of it, so that way you can also follow along with us. If we have any questions as we go through, just let me know. I'll answer your questions, and then we'll keep on going through. And then once we finish, again, you know, we have Alex here from Plaza Home Loans who will be able to answer any other questions you may have as far as the lender side goes with the offer to purchase and the compensation. We need one more because Eric just walked in. One more just walked in. All right. There you go. All right, so we'll start at the top of the offer to purchase and contract 2T. Terms and definitions. So as you can see, the top, we have the seller and the buyer. So of course, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's where the seller and buyer will go. And then you have the property. Under the property, you have to include street address, city, zip, county. A lot of times you may not be able to find the lot, unit, block, or section, but you may be able to locate a subdivision if it isn't a subdivision. But the biggest things you want to take out from this one to make sure you have in there besides the street address, the city, the zip, and the county is going to be the PIN or the PID, the parcel ID number. And then under other description is where you would put the legal description. And then on the bottom line, you have the deed, book, and page. All of those numbers and information can be pulled straight from the GIS or tax records. If you have questions later on how to locate that, let me know and I can show you that. But just you want to make sure that you verify those and you put in those correct numbers because you want to make sure that you are selling the correct property. Next, will this property include a manufactured mobile home? You need to check it will or it will not. When you're filling out the offer to purchase, you want to make sure that every section that has an option is filled out. If there is nothing that goes in that section, then you want to put either none or NA. It's never a good idea to leave things just blank. Try to put something in there to make sure that it is known that that either does not apply or is not applicable. Next is, will the property that is transferring include an off-site septic, lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, or storage unit? Is there anything that's transferring with this property as far as those that is on a separate lot? Anything that would be a great example of that is a lot of townhomes and condo complexes may have a parking space and a parking deck. If you have a community on the lake, they may have a deeded boat slip. There may be a situation where a septic field is in the property, but then there is a septic easement that encroaches onto the adjacent property as far as that septic lot goes. So if that is a situation and that is being checked, then you also definitely want to look at including the additional provisions addendum to spell out more in detail what that situation may be. Are there any additional parcels that are transferring with this property? Great example of that would be if you're selling a home and they're also selling the adjacent piece of land next door. If that's going with the sale, you want to check that box and then let that be known. And then also, again, if you're doing that, you may want to include another addendum spelling that out to make sure that it is all on the up and up and the property is being transferred properly. Moving down into our filling out of the prices, we have purchase price. First is the offer amount, the full purchase price amount. Then you have your due diligence fee and your initial earnest money deposit. How much are those being offered? So you want to make sure you put number values in those. If there are none, then you want to put 0. Due diligence fee, once you put that in, how is that due diligence fee being sent to the seller? You would want to check one of these boxes: cash, personal check, official bank check, wire transfer, or electronic transfer. If you're doing an electronic transfer, example Zelle, PayPal, Venmo, anything like that, and the buyer is getting a loan, you want to verify with the lender that that mode of transmitting those funds is appropriate for that loan that they're using. Same thing if you're doing cash. If they are transferring cash, you may have to cross-reference that with the lender to make sure that that cash that's being paid has been verified by the lender. You know, if you just have someone who has a box under their bed with cash in it and that's how they want to pay their deposits and they're getting a loan, that cash has not been verified by the lender, so that cash may not be able to be used to pay these deposits. If they're not using a loan, then a lot of that would not be applicable. But just know, if you're doing anything other than something quote unquote might consider standard, you may want to run it by the lender just to make sure that they approve of it, because we'd rather address that early than have to backtrack later on. Same thing with earnest deposit, the initial earnest deposit. So the initial earnest deposit is a check that'll be made out to the escrow agent and is supposed to be delivered within 5 days of the effective date. How are they paying that earnest deposit? Another option you have is cash, personal check, wire transfer, any of those. Make sure you check one of those, however that is being planned on being transferred. Then you have additional earnest money. Is there any additional earnest money? Why would there be additional earnest money? A great reason that may be is if you have a buyer that's making an offer on a property, they're willing to offer a little bit of earnest money up front. They want to verify something, say that we have a septic inspection. Once that septic inspection has been approved, then they may be willing to pay the additional earnest money. That may be an example of that. If there's any additional earnest money, would be any earnest money that's being paid and doable that is not part of the initial earnest money. So when would that be paid? You need to make sure that you put that date on there, and that is, of course, time is of the essence. So it has to be paid by 5 p.m. on blank date. Next is assumption. Is the buyer assuming a loan? And if so, how much of that, what is the value of that loan that they are assuming? If that's a case of, in the situation, that would go into here. That is basically like seller financing. Not seller financing, loan assumption. Seller financing's next. Loan assumption. Does everybody understand what a loan assumption is? Yeah? For those that don't, I'll briefly go into a loan assumption. Is if you're selling a house and you have a loan on it and your buyer is able to take over that loan, to assume it, take over that loan and now be responsible for the loan payments. Pass that back, please. So if there is a portion of this purchase price that is being assumed by a loan, that would go into that line. Now again, if you don't have any of these, put a 0 in there. Seller financing. Is the seller financing some of the purchase price of this property? If so, how much of that initial offer is the seller financing? That amount would go there. If you are doing seller financing, then you very well may want to include the seller financing addendum. It breaks out the terms and spells out the terms of this seller financing. Want to make sure we have all of those addendums if they are applicable in these situations. Next is building deposit. Is there a building deposit for a new construction? You usually only see this with new construction. If you do have a building deposit, then you may want to include the new construction addendum, which would spell that out. So if there is a builder's deposit, that amount would go right there. Now, once you have all those lines filled out, whether there's a numerical value or just a zero, you will total all those up, subtract it from the top initial offer amount, and at the bottom line would be the monies that would be owed at closing by the buyer. Because assuming this contract makes it to closing, all of these other deposit amounts and seller financing and loan assumption come off the cash to close for the purchase price. Now, cash to close does not include any other lender fees or anything like that. That's just as far as the offer of the home. Okay? Sound good? Letter E, seller concessions. Is the buyer asking for any seller concessions to be paid at settlement by the seller? Now, if you have seller concessions, this is another item that you may want to run by the lender if the buyer is getting a loan, to make sure that the amount that is being asked for is okay with the loan. Because some loans may only allow up to 3% in seller concessions, some loans may allow up to 6%. If you're asking for 7% and the loan only allows 6%, that other one, the buyer won't be able to use or receive. So you want to make sure that numbers are run by the loan officer and the loan officer is approving of them if they're being offered. And that can include any fees or things that may be paid that a buyer may have to pay for them getting the loan or purchasing the home. Seller concessions can be, closing costs. We're going to talk in a little bit about commission, because it's possible it could be commission or any other thing that the buyer is asking for up front for the seller to pay for throughout when the contract comes to closing. F, due diligence period. The due diligence period. Are we asking for a due diligence period? If so, we have two options. We're asking for a due diligence period running through a specific date. Or are we asking for the due diligence period to be a set number of days after the effective date of the contract? So you want to fill out one of those. If you do the date, then you must put an exact date in there, and that runs through 5 p.m. on that date. If you're doing an X number of days after the effective date, then you'll put example 21 days, and it will run 5 till 5 p.m. on that 21st day, if that's what you're asking for, is 21 days. So make sure you fill out one of those if you're having a due diligence period. If there is no due diligence period, then you don't have to fill that part out. Settlement date. What date do both parties agree that settlement will take place on? That needs to be a date. You can also put in a time like 45 days after the effective date. If you put 45 days after the effective date on this contract, I have had situations where people have come back, say lenders, and said, can we just change that to a calendar date once we have the contract and know what the effective date is? So just keep that in mind. If you have that situation come up, you may have to go back and change that to an actual calendar date, not just X number of days after the effective date. Page 1. Now, once page 1 is agreed upon with buyer and seller initial the bottom. Next, earnest money deposit. Earnest money deposit is a deposit, of course, made by the buyer that will be held in escrow. That earnest money deposit is due within 5 days of the effective date. If that earnest money is not due and payable within the 5 days of the effective date, the seller can call that money due and payable. There is a form that they can use to do that if it's not paid, but it should be paid within 5 days. That deposit now is held in escrow until closing, or if the contract were to terminate, then it will be dispersed according to how all parties agree. If all parties do not agree how that earnest money will be dispersed, then that money cannot be dispersed until all parties are in agreement. If they never come to agreeance, then after a period of time, the money will be turned over to the clerk of court, and then the court will handle how that is held or dispersed from there. But just know that that earnest money deposit has to be held in an escrow account. The next section is escrow agent. Who is the escrow agent that will be holding this escrow account deposit, this escrow deposit? Our firm has a trust account, so we can hold earnest deposits. A lot of times you may see attorneys on here. Whoever is holding it has to be responsible and have a trust account, and they will have to acknowledge once they receive it. And we'll go over the last page about receiving of deposits when we get there, but just who is the escrow agent is who goes in that line. And also it is in big letters in this that if the escrow agent, example a brokerage, if the brokerage has a trust-bearing account, that this escrow deposit can be held in a trust-bearing account, and the interest-bearing account, and the interest can be held by the owner of the escrow account. So that it is spelled out in here that if there is interest that is accrued, that interest is the property of the escrow agent. Next is the effective date. The effective date is the date that buyer and seller both have signed and initialed every page on this contract, and a copy of this contract has been sent to both parties. That is now your effective date. Everybody should know what the effective date is, but yes, make sure everybody has signed it and then someone has received a copy of it. Due diligence. The due diligence period is a period that the buyer is encouraged to do all of their investigative reporting, their inspections, their appraisals, anything else that they want to do to make sure that this is the property that they want to continue to pursue and go to closing. The due diligence fee is a fee that is paid directly to the seller. That fee is paid directly to the seller and is supposed to be accompanied with the contract, with the offer, paid doable upon the day of the effective date. That deposit is made directly out to the seller, and in most cases that deposit is non-refundable to a buyer unless the seller is in breach of contract. Other than that, there's really not many other situations where the due diligence is refunded to the buyer. So make sure that your buyer understands this. This fee, in essence, is basically, and what it is intended to do is to compensate the seller to take the house off the market, let the buyer do their due diligence, and make sure that this is the house that they want to consume and go to closing. Like the due diligence and the earnest money, if they are received and it is not valid funds, check bounces, something like that, the seller can now call those monies due, and they can be requested either a wire or official bank check. So just know if you have a personal check that bounces, it needs to get replaced with either a wire or a bank check, and that the seller now can request those monies to be paid immediately. Settlement. The next two sections, we have settlement and we have closing. Settlement is, everybody know the difference? Yes, settlement is the day that all the papers are signed and everything is agreed upon and everything is consummated. Closing is the day that everything is now been recorded with the Register of Deeds. A lot of times those two take place on the same day, but not always. You may have a settlement that takes place late in the afternoon. Closing may not be till the following morning. Your buyer does not take ownership of the home until closing, till it's recorded. Just like seller does not have to give up the home until closing. Next section. This one is new to the offer to purchase, but attorney closings in North Carolina. North Carolina Bar Association and NC Realtors. Now make sure they put it in here that a closing attorney must be hired to consummate closing. There are certain things that can be done as far as closing that a licensed attorney, that an unlicensed person can do that's not an attorney, but in order to fully do closing and do everything that closing is supposed to happen, they now spell out there that you need to hire a closing attorney. So make sure we all know that closing attorneys have to handle closing. Special assessments. Special assessments, if there are any special assessments, there's another section that spells about who pays those, but it's anything that is assessed against the property that is confirmed prior to closing is going to be responsibility of the seller. The buyer understands that if there are any special assessments that come after closing that were not confirmed prior to closing, the buyer understands that they will take this property with those that they could be coming down the line. Page 2, everybody agrees. We again initial buyer and seller, initial bottom of page 2. Next section, fixtures and exclusions. No party should assume that anything is going with the home or not going with the home. If there's something that is in question, you want to make sure you put it in the contract. Fixtures that are included in the purchase price. All existing fixtures, including in the sale, part of the purchase price shall transfer with the home. We have bullet points of a lot of things that are fixtures. There may not be everything in these bullet points, but a fixture is something that goes with the home that is either attached or built into the home that fits into that home. You may have something that is not a fixture. That is a fixture that may not be attached to the home, but if it is built into a section of that home and meant for that, then that classifies now as a fixture. A great example of that is if you have bookshelves that go around a mantle. If they are not bolted into the wall, they are not a fixture attached to the home, but they are considered fixtures because they were designed to fit in that area. That is classified a fixture. Anything that is a fixture is supposed to stay with the home. There are exceptions of that, and if there are, that has to be wrote down in one of the lower lines. We'll get to that one in just a moment. Unpairing and deleting data from devices. Sellers are required to unpair themselves from any devices in the home. Ring camera, outdoor cameras, thermostats, anything like that. They are required to delete all of their information and unpair themselves from it. And this is one of the parts of the contract that extends past closing. If a seller does not do it by closing, that does not alleviate their obligation to do that. They still must do that. Because you may have someone say, well, we just sold the house, it's not my problem anymore. This is one of the situations that it surpasses closing. Whether they closed or not, they still need to unpair and delete all their information. They cannot spy on the new buyers once they sell their home. Items leased or not owned. So now this section is for items that are leased or not owned, that are items that are leased or not owned that are in the house that shall not convey with the home. So is there anything that shall not convey with the home that is not leased, that is leased or not owned? If there is an oil tank, a lot of oil tanks are leased. Is the seller going to return that prior to closing? If all parties agree, they have the right to do that. Most sellers are not going to return something like that, but if there is something like that, will it be returned? If there's something that is leased or not owned, for example, like kitchen appliances, if they are conveying with the home, the seller has to pay all those off prior to closing. If they're taking them with them, you need to spell that out, that they are not conveying with the home. Next is other items that do not convey. This would be items that are fixtures. Are there any fixtures that the seller is taking with them that they are not selling with the home? If they are, the seller is required to repair or replace whatever they are taking. If they take something off the wall, they cannot just leave holes in the wall. They need to repair that. If they take light fixtures away, they may be asked to replace that with another light fixture. They can't just leave damaged space in the house because they decided to take something as far as a fixture. Once that page is all agreed upon, sign or initial buyer and seller on the bottom. Personal property. Personal property. Is there any personal property that the seller is going to leave to the buyer at no cost? Personal property. Example of that may be refrigerator or washer and dryer. Anything like that. If there is any personal property that's being left, this is another situation where you want to run it by the lender if the buyer is getting a loan. Because sometimes lenders may not allow personal property to convey at no cost because they're loaning for a house. They're not loaning for a house and a car. I know a car sounds kind of extreme, but it's very possible a car could transfer with a home. But you want to run that by the lender if you have that. Now, if you have personal property that's transferring and the lender does not want it in the contract, then you may have to do a separate bill of sale for that. And the value on the bill of sale could be zero if there's no value being transferred with this personal property. But sometimes you may have to have it separate from the contract. You just want to run it by the lender. Number 4, the buyer's due diligence process. Buyers strongly encouraged to conduct all of their due diligence during the due diligence process, period. Items that would be done during the due diligence: your home inspection, your appraisal, reviewing any government documents, CC&Rs, HOA documents, anything like that. The loan, insurance, surveys, zoning and governmental regulations, flood hazard and water hazard, utilities and access, streets and roads, and special assessments. Buyers encouraged to investigate all of these items during their due diligence period to make sure that they understand it all and they are okay with all of it before moving on and consummating the deal. It is your job as the buyer's agent, if you represent the buyer, to assist in reviewing all of this. If the buyer wants any of this done, it is your job to assist in doing that. Make sure you're able to get what they want, review it with them, make sure it's explained to them, and that they understand it and okay with anything that they may have questions about. Letter C, sale or lease of existing property. Now, just because that is in here, this contract is not contingent on a buyer selling or leasing another property. They can put it in here that they have to do it, but if they do not sell or lease it, that does not give the buyer rights to get all of their deposits back, because North Carolina contract is as is in its current condition with really no contingencies like that, unless that contingency is agreed upon by all parties. Anything that is agreed upon by all parties can be part of the contract. But this contract, the way it is standardly written, is not contingent for the buyer to sell or lease one of those properties. Letter D, repair, improvement, negotiations, and agreement. This contract, again, is stating that this house is being sold as is in its current condition and its current location. That does not mean that the buyer cannot ask for repairs, improvements, and negotiate those. They sure can. They can be agreed upon, but the seller has no obligation to do any repairs, any improvements, or even negotiate any of this stuff. Seller's under no obligation to do that. But if all parties agree, then it can be done. Buyer's obligation to repair damage. If the buyer were to do any damage to the property during their due diligence or just accidental damage, that buyer is responsible to repair that. A great example would be as if you're doing a home inspection and home inspector damages something, buyer is responsible for that. Buyer can go after the home inspector, but per this contract, the buyer is responsible to repair that. If you're walking through the home one day and you walk through a screen door and break the screen door, buyer is responsible to repair that. Just let buyer know any damages that's done by the buyer or anybody hired by the buyer is responsible to repair those damages. Letter F, indemnity. Buyer will indemnify and hold seller harmless of any loss, damage, claims, suits that shall arise from any conduct the buyer is doing while at the property. Now, that does not apply to anything that the seller has as far as negligence or trying to hide or cover up. Now, if the buyer were to fall off the stairs and the stairs are perfectly fine, the seller is holding the seller harmless of that. Now, if the seller has a rug over a hole in the floor, buyer steps on the rug and falls through a hole. Now, that is a different situation. Seller could be held liable for that because that is something they were negligent about and did not disclose. But just know that if the buyer were to do something as far as get hurt, loss, damage, anything like that, the seller is held harmless for that. Buyer's right to terminate. Buyer's right. Buyer has the right in North Carolina to terminate for any reason or no reason at all. Now, depending on when the buyer terminates, the buyer may have liquidated damages to the seller, example, due diligence or the earnest money, depending on when they terminate. But if they terminate during the due diligence period, then they are entitled to get a refund on their earnest deposit. If they were to terminate outside of the due diligence period, then they may not have a right to get their earnest deposit. The seller now has a claim to that earnest deposit. Next section, letter H, big red letters. Closing shall constitute acceptance of the property in its then existing condition unless a provision is otherwise made in writing. So closing, the buyer is taking the property in its condition the way it is. Buyer accepts that and agrees to that unless there is another provision in writing. Buyer representation. How is the buyer, the first section is funds. How is the buyer paying for this house? You have two options, cash or a loan. If they're paying cash, check the box with cash. And then is there proof of funds included with this offer? Yes or no? Next is a loan. Is the buyer getting a loan? If they're getting a loan, are they getting a first mortgage loan? If so, what type of loan is that? If they're getting a second mortgage loan, please explain what kind of second mortgage loan they're getting. If they're getting other funds, write out what type of other funds that may be. Another example of other funds could be hard money. You may have a buyer using hard money lenders. So if they're using that, that needs to be spelled out in that section. All pages agreed upon, buyer and seller initial at the bottom. Now we're back to other property. Does the buyer have to buy or does the buyer have to sell or lease another property before closing on this deal? Yes or no? If it is yes, what is that property's address? And then, is that property under contract, or is it not under contract, or is it actively listed with a licensed real estate broker? Will it be listed with a licensed broker, or will the buyer be attempting to sell it or lease it without the assistance of a licensed real estate broker? So if they do have to sell or lease a property before closing on this deal, you need to let it be known as of the day of this offer which one of these applies. It's as of the day of this offer. Performance of buyer's financial obligation. To the best of the buyer's knowledge, there's no other circumstances that the buyer would not be able to perform their obligation as far as their financial ways and means of coming up with the funds to purchase the home. Next section, residential property and owners association disclosure statement. Has the buyer received a signed copy of that prior to making this offer? We have three options. We have yes, no, or is it exempt from the property disclosure statement. If they have received a signed copy of it, then you will check yes. If they have not received it yet, but it is not exempt, then you would check no. If they have not received it and the contract goes under contract, the buyer has the right to still terminate either within 3 calendar days of the effective date or within 3 calendar days of the day they received the disclosure statement. And it's whichever one of those comes first. Seems kind of weird, right? How would 3 days of you receiving the disclosure come before 3 days of the effective date? The only way that could happen would be is if you received the disclosure 3 days after making the first offer, they counter back, and then before you get a contract, 3 days from the day they received it. That's how 3 days would come before the effective date, 3 days after the effective date. Does that make sense? Because I had someone ask me that. They're like, well, if you receive it on the effective date, they're going to come at the same time. Or if you receive it 2 days after the effective date, 3 days after the effective date comes before you have 3 days to review it. So how can the other one come first? An example. Or is this property exempt? There are a number of reasons why it could be exempt. And if you pull up the statute, it will explain all those reasons. Some great options of reasons that it may be exempt would be new construction if the home has never been lived in. Only if it's never been lived in. A foreclosure, an estate sale. All of those are exempt. There's a couple other ones. I don't remember all of them, but if you pull up this North Carolina statute, it spells all of them out. Next, mineral oil and gas rights disclosure. Same as the RPODs. Have they received a copy of it? Yes, no, or is it exempt? Same thing as the other one. Same, just make sure you check one of those. Buyer obligations, section 6. We're going to get into buyer obligations. The first section is timely payment of earnest money and due diligence fee. Or is there dishonored funds? Dishonored funds would be like a bounced check. Buyer must turn in the due diligence fee over to the seller at time of contract. Earnest money is due within 5 days. If the monies are not paid, then the seller may use Form 355 to demand funds from the buyer if they haven't been paid in time or if they are no good funds. And then initial the bottom, buyer and seller. Responsibility of special assessments. The buyer shall take title subject to all special assessments that may be approved following settlement. So if there are special assessments that are approved following settlement, the buyer understands they are taking this property with those and the seller is not obligated to pay those. Responsibility of special assessments. Next is responsibility of certain costs. Buyer is responsible to pay their own costs, whether those costs be anything as far as like appraisal, anything costs that come on the buyer's side. If there's any fees associated with the HOA, the closing attorney, the lender, preparation or recording of all instruments required is secure the balance of the purchase price unpaid at settlement. If there's anything that constitutes with the lender, HOA, the deed, anything like that, that's the buyer's side. The buyer's responsible for those fees. Next is authorization to disclose information. Buyer understands that the closing attorney, the lender, and the real estate agent may have to disclose some information that is pertinent to close the deal. That does not mean that these people can disclose anything and everything. They can only disclose what is necessary to consummate the deal. But buyer understands that information may be shared amongst parties if it is necessary. Now let's move on to seller representations. First, ownership. Has the property been owned by the seller for at least 1 year, for less than 1 year, or does the seller not yet own the property? You must check one of those. Everybody understand how a seller may not yet own the property. It could be a novation or an assignment of contract. A person takes a property under contract. They're going to find a buyer that's going to buy it for a higher price than that contract and assign that contract to another person. That's how this section could be filled out as far as seller does not yet own the property. Lead-based paint addendum. If the house was built prior to 78, lead-based paint addendum must be attached with this contract. That is required under federal law. Next is owners association and dues. Is there an HOA? Is there an owners association? If so, check the box. Name of the association, what are the dues, when are they paid, and phone number, address, website, email address, any information that we have as far as the HOA, we want to make sure that gets put in there. If there's 2 associations, then you put in 2. If there's not, then you may want to put none or NA in those lines. Letter D, going on to fuel tanks and the fuel. Is there a fuel tank located on the property? Yes or no? If there is, then we need to fill in the information about that fuel tank. Where is it located? Is it in use? Yes or no? Is it owned or leased? And what type of fuel is it? And who is the vendor that fills and maintains it? And then once that page is done, buyer and seller initial the bottom. Tanks included in the sale. Buyer and seller agree that any tank described here will be transferred with the property. And then the big one, next one is fuel. Sellers need to understand that per this contract, they can use the fuel that's in the tank, but at closing, they cannot sell the fuel that's in the tank back to the company. Whatever fuel is left must stay there and is now going to transfer with the home. The seller cannot say, well, I have 50 gallons of oil, I want to sell it back and get my money back. Can't do that. Can't do that. That can be constituted as a breach of contract if the seller were to do that per this section of the contract. So if you have a fuel tank, you want to make sure that conversation is had with all parties to be known that it cannot be done. Inspections. So this one, supplier consent. Buyer shall be entitled to conduct inspections on the fuel tank, whether they want to make sure that it is operational, they want to make sure that there's oil or fuel in there, how much is in there. They have the right to inspect it, to do any that information they want. Contact the supplier, contact the person who maintains it, whatever they want to do, they have the right to inspect that fuel tank to make sure that it is operational, if it's being sold as operational, and it is working in its proper manner. Leases. Is there a lease on the property? Yes or no? If there is a lease, then you may want to attach the additional provisions addendum, spelling out the terms of that lease, and have a copy of the lease relayed to the buyer. Letter 8, seller's obligations. Big one, evidence of title and payoff statement. Seller is obligated to pay off any type of debt that they have on anything that is transferring with the home, including the home. If there's anything that they owe money on that's transferring with the home, they are required to have all that paid off at or before closing. Anything, solar panels, anything that they may have leased, anything like that, they have to have everything paid off. Seller shall provide to the closing attorney contact information so the closing attorney can get these payoff letters if this closing attorney is going to handle those. Usually, the closing attorney is going to handle any type of loans, HELOCs, home equity lines of credit, anything like that. Usually, the attorney will handle the payoff. Now, if it's something as far as like something else, solar panels, the seller may want to take care of that themselves. But if they do, we still want to make sure that that payoff has been sent to the attorney so it can be verified that it is paid off prior to closing. Next is authorization to disclose information. Just like the buyer, the seller understands that parties may have to disclose information pertinent to closing and consummating of this deal. Seller understands that information can be shared amongst the buyer, lenders, attorneys, HOA, whoever may be a part of this deal, that if information needs to be shared, the seller understands that information may be shared. Access to the property. Access. The seller has to give the buyer access to the property to do their due diligence, to do their walkthrough. If there are repairs done, the seller has to give the buyer access to go back and inspect these said repairs. Seller cannot not allow the buyer to go back or do their due diligence or their walkthrough or re-inspect after repairs have been done. Seller understands that they have to give the buyer access to the property. Removal of the seller's property. Another big one. Seller is responsible to remove all of their personal property, including debris and trash. So when the seller moves out, they cannot just leave trash all over the house. They must remove that. All their personal property, debris, and trash, unless agreed upon. Now, if they're agreed upon to leave things, then they're entitled to leave those. But a seller cannot just say, I don't want to take that, I'm just going to leave it for the buyer and make it their responsibility. If it is not agreed upon, they cannot do that. Next is settlement deliverables. So this one, I got to read through this one real quick. All right, so the affidavit and indemnification agreement. The seller is required to sign that at closing. That states that the seller does not owe money to anybody that has done work on the property in the last 120 days. If someone has done work, the seller understands that they've paid them off, and there is nobody that can come back as far as the mechanic's lien. Anything like that, they will have to sign that at closing. That if they had work done, they paid the worker off. Seller is not a foreign person defined by the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. If the seller is a foreign person and they are selling a property in the United States, they have to make sure that we understand and they understand that if they fall under this Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act, that is taken care of. If you have any questions about that, that is a great legal question. Get in touch with the closing attorney, have them address that situation. With us not being attorneys, that's something beyond our scope of work. If that is applicable to either buyer or seller in any reason, make sure that runs by the closing attorney. Letter F, designation of lien agent, payment and satisfaction of liens. Seller shall designate a lien agent. Example, the closing attorney can be a lien agent to make sure that these liens are satisfied and paid off, that they will give any information deemed necessary to that person to make sure these liens are satisfied prior or at closing. Letter G, good title, legal access. The seller understands that they must issue a general warranty deed to the buyer at closing, and that this property must contain legal access, whether that be a legal right-of-way or an easement, but that the property has legal right-of-way access to access the property, and that the seller is transferring a clean general warranty deed to the buyer at closing. Governmental compliance, letter H, that when this property is transferred, that there is no violation and any issues with government compliance as far as zoning, stormwater, building permits, anything like that. If there's any violations, seller is taking care of those prior to closing, or unless all parties agree that the buyer will take it in that situation. But if not, seller understands that any of those will be addressed and resolved prior to closing. Deed taxes and fees. How is the buyer taking this deed? If your buyer is taking the deed in their name, you put their name. If they're taking the deed in an LLC, you put the LLC. How is this buyer taking property? Owners Association fees and charges. Seller shall pay all charges and fees associated from the HOA management company that would fall under seller's obligation. And that's later spelled out in 9A, which we'll get there in just a minute. Payment of special assessments. Any special assessments that are confirmed prior to closing, seller is responsible to pay. If there is not an exact amount that has been determined, then seller must pay a reasonable amount for those special assessments. I don't know of a situation why they wouldn't have an amount, but it says that if a reasonable amount can be determined if there is not an exact amount. And buyer understands that that reasonable amount will constitute the only seller's obligation. If that reasonable amount is not the exact amount after closing, then buyer may have to make up the difference. Late listing penalties. Seller must pay all late listing penalties. Everybody know what a late listing penalty is, or could be? Late listing penalty usually is going to apply to businesses. If owner is a company, LLC, and you must list all of your assets with the county or the state every year. If you don't do that, you can get what's called a late listing penalty. I mean, you did not share your information with the county or the state as far as your business. You know, this would not apply to a person, but like if you have a company, a business, an LLC, you have to pay taxes on your property that you own, whether it's personal property or, you know, real estate property. And if you do not list that and address it with the state, there may be what's called a late listing penalty, and that late listing penalty must be paid by the seller. It's not very common, but that's what it is. Negotiated repairs and improvements. If there are negotiated repairs and improvements, the seller must do them in a good workmanlike manner. That does not state that the seller has to have a licensed contractor do them. They just have to be done in a good workmanlike manner, and the buyer has the right to reinspect those said improvements or repairs once they are done. Home warranty. Is a home warranty being offered in this contract? If not, you check the first box. If it is who's getting it? Is the buyer obtaining a home warranty that will be paid for by the seller not to exceed a certain amount? Or is the seller offering a home warranty or obtaining a home warranty to the buyer that will not exceed a set amount? If a home warranty is being offered, whether it's the buyer or the seller is obtaining it, you need to make sure that is spelled out, and what is that value. Why is there a value? Because a buyer may be wanting a home warranty. The seller may be willing to pay, say, up to $800. If the buyer wants a home warranty at $1,000, then the buyer will be responsible for that additional $200 above what the seller agrees they will pay for. Charges, next section, charges by the Owners Association. Seller shall pay any fee in completing the Residential Property Owners Association by the HOA. If there is a fee for the Owners Association to complete the Owners Association disclosure statement, that is a fee that the seller is responsible for. Seller shall pay any fees or assessments, including proration. If there's a prorated fee, the seller is responsible all the way through the day of closing. Buyer is responsible from the day after closing through the end of the year. Next, on the same thing, is if there's any fee with transferring or updating ownership. If there's any transfer fees, the seller is responsible for that. Any fee that is specifically required to be paid by the buyer, then the buyer shall pay that from Owners Association, which if there's any capital contributions, setting up of their own account with the HOA, anything like that that pertains to the buyer will be responsible to pay those. Number 10, prorations and adjustments. Anything that is prorated, again, seller is responsible from January 1 through the day of closing. Buyer is responsible from day after closing through December 31st. Prorations will be divided up that way, whether they are taxes, property taxes, HOA dues and fees. If there's a lease, the rents, anything like that that is prorated, it will be prorated at closing. So those next is A, B, C, and D are examples of what I just spelled out. Taxes of real personal property, rents or dues. Condition of property, risk of loss. Condition of property. The seller and buyer understand that the home has to be in the same or better condition at closing as it was the day of contract. So if something happens to the house during the process of this contract that brings down the condition of the property, seller is obligated to repair or replace that to bring it back to the condition that the property was at time of contract. If the property were to burn down, knock on wood, hopefully that doesn't happen. Now the buyer can still move forward with the contract, and the buyer is now entitled to the insurance money if they want to move on with the contract. But if not, they have a right to terminate, and they could be owed all of their monies back because now the property is not in the same condition. If the buyer still wants to buy it, though, they can still buy it, and if there's insurance, they would be entitled to collect that insurance. Now, but because of this, you want to make sure seller understands that they are definitely encouraged to keep their homeowner's insurance active all the way through closing, just in case something crazy happens. So let your seller know. Make sure they maintain their homeowner's insurance. They do not want to cancel it, because if the house were to burn down and their insurance was canceled, seller's up the creek. Delay in settlement and closing. So per this contract, both parties have a built-in 7-day delay period. So either party may delay closing up to 7 days. If that delay is going to exceed those 7 days, you are now asked to fill in a extension. You would do amendment to contract to extend that closing date. Don't think that, oh, well, if we all just say we can go past 7 days, everybody's okay with that. You want to have that deducted to writing, anything past that 7 days. If there is any delay in closing, even if it's just 1 day, you may be required to have a change of closing date anyways, because a lender may require that. So just know, if there is any change in closing date, the lender may require the addendum to change the closing date. But there is a 7-day built-in delay in the contract. Number 13, possession. Possession will take place at closing. That's when possession will change hands. But there is situations where buyer may possess the home prior to closing, or seller may possess the home after closing. If that happens, then you want to check one of these boxes and make sure that addendum is now filled out and prepared. And again, if that's happening, you may want to contact your insurance company, whether you're on the seller or buyer side. Make sure that insurance companies are aware of what's going on to make sure that the home is still covered under insurance. Number 14, addenda. Are there any other addendas that would be attached to this contract? If so, you must check that box. If you have an addenda that is attached to this contract, but this box is not checked, then that addenda is not part of this contract. It is just a piece of paper. Make sure that addenda is checked. If that addenda is not on one of these boxes, then under other attorney or party drafted addenda, spell out what that addenda is and make sure that it is attached to this contract. Assignments, number 15. This contract cannot be assigned to another party without all parties in agreement. Number 16, tax deferred exchange. That is like a 1031 tax exchange. That is the only time that this contract can be assigned, would be as if it is under a tax deferred exchange. Everybody know what a 1031 tax exchange is? Yes, 1031 tax exchange. You're selling an investment property. You're buying a new investment property, and you're taking all the money you're making off of one you're selling and putting it into the one you're buying to avoid taxes. You're basically just moving money from one property to another. If you're doing a deferred tax exchange, then you want to make sure that the attorney is aware of this plenty time in advance, because they have to make sure that everything is handled properly as far as that, if there is a deferred tax exchange. Parties. All parties in this contract, this will be a binding contract between these parties, their heirs, and their successors. So if one of the parties to this contract were to pass, their heirs or successors can still uphold this contract and keep it moving. So just know that that is possible. Survival. Any provision herein can survive the contract. If there is a provision that survives this contract through closing, that it will still be in play. Example of that would be if you have the buyer or seller possession after closing. That is an addenda to this contract that will survive closing. If there is something else that is survived closing, that it will survive closing as long as it is a part of this contract and it states it survives closing. Other than that, once closing happens, everything now has been severed and it is now buyer's house, no longer seller's responsibility. But if there is something that survives, it will survive. This is the entire agreement. It has been represented by all parties that this is the entire agreement. There's no other side agreement, and it will be recorded in its fashion. So if we get to closing, this contract will be recorded as far as closing, and the property will transfer hands. Conduct of transaction. Conduct of transaction, this one is not totally new, but it states that in this transaction that electronic means can be used as far as signing. Not everything has to be wet signed. Electronic means can be used. Now, how do we verify electronic means? On the last, or the, not next page, but the following page, there is seller email and buyer email. Whatever email that the buyer and seller put in there, that email address is used to verify that this person is who they say they are and they are signing this part of this contract. So that's a big one as far as for using electronic signatures. That electronic signatures are legal and used, and you can use them in this situation. But those electronic signatures can only go through the email that is in the other page. When we get there, I'll point that one out. Execution. This contract may be signed in multiple originals or counterparts, but all of those multiple originals and counterparts are to be said as one, to create one contract. So if you sign 4 pages today, 4 pages tomorrow, they come in together as one. If we have 2 copies of it, buyer signs 1, seller signs 1, we swap them, then they each sign both of them. We have 2 contracts, but they are considered one. All right, computation of days and time. This one gets asked a fair amount. Computation of days and time is calendar days, including holidays, including weekends. There is no work days, banking days. If it's 5 days, it is 5 days, calendar days. There's no exception for any holidays or weekends. Number 23, remedies. If it is a breach by buyer or breach by seller. If the buyer were to breach the contract, what do the seller has as far as remedies for that? The biggest thing that the seller has would be just forfeiture of the earnest money. They've already got the due diligence money. They could get the earnest money. Now, there could be monetary remedies as far as if the seller has to hire an attorney to collect these deposits, then the buyer could be responsible to pay those. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of remedy that the seller can take if the buyer breaches. Now, if the seller breaches the contract, buyer now has the right to recoup any money that they may have spent as far as their deposits and any money they may have spent during their due diligence period. Their inspections, their appraisals, anything like that, the buyer may be able to get all that from the seller. Or the buyer can continue with the contract and seek remedy as far as specific performance. They could make the seller still sell them the house. If that happens, you need to get the attorneys involved, let the attorneys handle it. But that is a possibility if the seller were to breach. Letter C on this one, attorney fees. If there are any legal proceedings brought to either party, buyer or seller, the prevailing party may go after the losing party for their attorney fees. So if it gets that far, the losing party may have to pay the prevailing party's attorney fees. Then this page you will have buyer and seller sign and date. If it's an entity buyer, then you do the name of the entity, who that person is that is authorized to sign in part of that entity, and sign and date it. Page 13, big red box, wire fraud. Make sure all parties understand, do not wire any money to anybody for any reason unless it has been confirmed by lender, attorney, and real estate agent. I would recommend have everybody confirm it before anybody sends any money. So make sure your party knows, do not wire any money. Notice information. This page you have your buyer's notice, your seller's notice, and then the agency's notice. Under buyer and seller, whatever email address that your buyer and seller put into this line, that is the email address that will be used as far as electronic signatures. So whatever email address they put, that's what email address needs to be used for electronic signatures. Whenever you do an electronic signature, you know you can get that page that says it was sent to this person at this time to this email address. That verifies they are signing it on behalf of themselves. Whatever email address needs to go in there. At the bottom, we have agency notice and addresses. If you are the buyer filling out an offer to purchase, you want to make sure all of your information is there, and it is good practice to put all of the listing agent's information in there. All that information you can get from the MLS. Last page of the contract, which is not technically a full page of the contract per this contract. This is just acknowledgement and receipt of monies. Whenever any due diligence or earnest money has been turned over, whoever has received it wants to sign and date and acknowledge that that money has been received. This is your receipts page. This page needs to be completed whenever any money has been turned over. Make sure it is done, because the lender is going to want to need to see it, attorney is going to want to need to see it, and also buyer and seller are going to want to know that money has been accounted for. All right, that's the offer to purchase and contract. Now, just real quick, there is an offer to purchase and contract worksheet. If you ever want to pull one of these up, it's a one-page sheet with all of the information that you would be filling out on this. This is not a contract. This is not part of the contract. But if you want to ever use this, say, to just get all the information together so when you fill out the contract, you have everything in here. So no, you can use this to help you, but this is not the contract and it is not part of the contract. Now, we finished that. We're going to get into the new information that just came out, I believe, Monday. We got an email from North Carolina Realtor Association about compensation now being part of the contract. Once we finish, if you have any questions about this, we'll go into that. But I just want to bring it to your attention that before this, there could never be any information included in the offer to purchase as far as compensation goes. Compensation is our fee for us doing our jobs. That could not be any part of the contract. But now they have said that it can be part of the contract. and it can be the addendum, the Form 220, the agreement to compensate can now be an addendum to the contract. What?
What number was it?
220.
Oh, okay.
So, so what this states that if you wish to do this, you have three options as far as how you can include compensation in the offer to purchase. Number one is attach the Form 220 to the contract. If you do that on the page that has addendums, which is page 10. On page 10, number 14, addenda. Is there any addenda attached to this? You can attach the Form 220 to it and put under here, other attorney drafted or party addenda. Put Form 220 and have it attached to the contract. Number two option is you can attach a custom attorney drafted addendum stating the commission is going to be paid and how much it is being paid and who is being paid by to. You can attach an attorney drafted addenda. The next is you can insert custom language into a purchase contract indicating the amount of the seller concessions that will be used for agent commission. If you do this, you may want to run it by the lender, and you also may want to get the attorney to draft that custom language. Because we as real estate agents are not attorneys, we cannot draft our own addenda or our own language. So if that is going to be put in there, then you may want to have the attorney draft that addenda and also run it by the lender. So you know, now that can be included in the offer to purchase. If you're going to include it in the offer to purchase, I would recommend you also sit down and discuss it with your manager. Make sure that we do it properly. If there is a lender, make sure you have the lender a part of it. Make sure that it is all compliant with them. And if there is any addenda or verbiage that is being drafted, make sure that you also run that by an attorney or have the attorney draw it up. You as an agent, again, you cannot draw up an addenda. You cannot write up verbiage as far as this goes because we are not attorneys. So make sure that that is done. If you have any questions about this, we will address that in just a moment when we finish. But I just wanted to point that out. That's the offer to purchase. That new offer to purchase came out this month. It was, 17 pages prior. Now it's 14, so they dropped 3 pages. Whenever you are preparing an offer to purchase, when you go into SkySlope or Zip Forms, make sure you pull up the new one. The old one is still in Zip Forms and SkySlope. Make sure you pull up the new one. If you receive an offer on your listing and it is the old offer to purchase, I would recommend contacting that buyer's agent and ask them to please draw it up on the new one. We want to be current. We want to be using the current forms, so let's make sure we use the current forms. With that being said, I want to thank everybody for coming. Those that are watching at home, I want to thank you for joining in. If you want to watch this later on, we will have it posted to the YouTube channel so you can watch it later and refresh yourself. It'll be there. If you pull it back up, make sure you like it. It helps us with advertising and marketing and our algorithms on YouTube. So thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great night.